In the frontier days of the American West, the Chuck Wagon was a mobile kitchen. In my Agile Chuck Wagon, I have the Agile, the Lean, the leadership, the programming techniques you need to bring your bland software implementation to life. You bring the project, I'll bring the fire. Let's get cooking. This episode of the Agile Chuck Wagon is brought to you by our Patreon backers. If you would like to back this show, help defray some of the costs, and get access to premium content, please visit us at patreon.com/AgileChuckWagon and look at the various levels of sponsorship. Thank you. Hello there. Today on the Agile Chuck Wagon, I want to start a series of podcasts that are based on a LinkedIn conversation I'm having with listener Jeff Davis. Jeff found me through the Badass Agile podcast. I would recommend Chris Williams' podcast. And I had asked him, what's a tricky Agile practice to teach as a coach? I'm going to devote each of these podcasts in a series to one of the answers that he or I gave to this question. And the one for today is staying true to the Scrum framework. This came up in the context of an observation Jeff made about human nature. He said that people tend to regress toward undisciplined behaviors when things get hard. And I have certainly noticed this in my practice as well. This came up pretty recently on the project that my teams work on. We were under a tight deadline, and I asked the teams to organize themselves differently and to start using Kanban. We had a fixed backlog of items that needed to get done by a certain date, and we found that the normal biweekly Scrum cadence that we had was interfering with our ability to deliver these features. We were acting in a Kanban-like manner. We were carrying stories from sprint to sprint, but we weren't following Scrum behavior. The deadline was fixed, so I didn't feel that I could help coach the team through that using Scrum. So I suggested that we adopt our process to match our behavior, and we were behaving much more in a Kanban style. My mistake was thinking that the training that everyone receives at the beginning of their tenure coming to my company about Kanban was sufficient in order for them to start working in that style without more coaching. At my company, our senior Agile coach teaches a thing that we call Agile Week, and we talk about the basics of Scrum for a few days, and we spend a day on Kanban. In particular, we play the Get Kanban board game. I've done an episode on that in the past if you want a refresher. But it turns out that the team had forgotten those lessons about limiting their work in progress and trying to finish work before starting new work. The end result was it was a little bit like a century ago when there were a bunch of settlers on the eastern border of Oklahoma, and they basically had a race for people to run and grab property. The same thing happened with my team. We set up the board and developers started picking stories that they thought were the most interesting or the easiest for them to accomplish. So we ended up starting a bunch of work, and it took a long time for those individual pieces to get delivered because of internal dependencies between the stories. We suffered from a couple of other problems as well. For example, many of these stories were not well refined before we started working on them, so these dependencies weren't immediately obvious. Nevertheless, I think that this story illustrates Jeff's point that people tend to gravitate to what they know when they're put under pressure. And especially for teams that are not mature in Scrum or some other process, when the going gets tough, there is a strong temptation to drop the process and go back to familiar ways. What can be especially tragic as a coach watching this situation is that you know from experience that following these processes will help you deliver faster and with higher quality than not following these processes, but it takes some empirical evidence, it takes some hands-on experience for people to understand that and internalize it. Without without that hands-on experience or without having seen a well-running process firsthand, it can be difficult to accept on faith that these process improvements will actually bear fruit. Jeff suggested that Scrum Masters often do not get the facilitation training that they need in order to help coach their teams through this situation. And that is definitely what I'm observing on my teams. These Scrum Masters do not have any formal training in Scrum besides the little bit that I spoke about in Agile Week. We don't ask our Scrum Masters, who are typically a QA or junior developers, we don't ask them to go through a certification program or any formal training beyond what we give. And so they're not very well equipped to deal with situations when the process breaks down or things are not operating smoothly. I myself was out of position to help with those teams because I was dealing with other challenges and could not be as hands-on with my Scrum Masters as I would have wished. Unfortunately, our Agile coach fell ill at the time as well. I wasn't able to find a way to help my teams get the information about Kanban that they needed in order to fix that particular issue and get back on track. So in summary, one tricky situation that Agile coaches find themselves in is when the going gets tough, the process gets abandoned. And so trying to stay true to the Scrum framework or whatever process you've chosen can become difficult. Jeff's recommending getting Scrum Masters some foundational training in facilitation. Another thing that certainly could have helped us would have been some hands-on refresher on basics of the process. In other words, continuing education. That certainly would have helped me in this most recent situation that came to mind. Look for other episodes on this topic of tricky Agile coaching topics in the feed in the coming weeks. Until then, I hope your Agile endeavors go well. It's time to pack up the Agile Chuck Wagon for now. The Agile Chuck Wagon podcast is written, directed, and produced by Chuck Durfee. Chuck is a software development manager and Agile coach in the Denver area. Thanks to Audionautics.com and freesound.org for the backing music and sound effects. You can reach this podcast on Twitter at AgileChuckWagon or by email at chuck@agilechuckwagon.com for comments and episode suggestions. Please also visit our Patreon page to support this podcast and learn about membership benefits. Thank you very much for listening.